Millionaire tortured his sick wife, but after she died, the truth made him regret it 1,000 times. In a grand estate perched upon a windswept hill, tragedy and desire intertwined in a way no one could have imagined. Richard Blackwood, a millionaire whose name was whispered in elite social circles, ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. By his side stood Isabella, his delicate wife, whose every breath wavered with an illness that slowly consumed her body. To the outside world, she lived in luxury, wrapped in the most expensive silks, fed on the finest gourmet meals. But behind closed doors, the walls of Blackwood Manor echoed with her whispered sobs. No one knew how deeply Isabella suffered until it was too late. Richard Blackwood was not always a cold-hearted man. In the early days of his youth, he was known among his friends as lively and generous, a cheerful sort who would share his last dollar with a friend in need. After inheriting his grandfather's empire, a vast conglomerate specializing in finance, real estate, and pharmaceuticals, Richard's life changed overnight. Wealth brought power, and power brought temptation. Over time, a bitter cynicism took hold of him, shielding him from the warmth of others' humanity. Still, on the surface, Richard maintained a veneer of respectability. He donated large sums to local charities, including the St. Lucia Children's Hospital, where he once met Dr. Andrew Montague, a soft-spoken pediatrician who quietly disapproved of Richard's abrupt manner. Society columns fawned over the elusive Mr. Blackwood, praising him for his philanthropic efforts and good breeding, as they called it. Behind that polished exterior, however, lay a heart that had hardened against compassion. When Richard met Isabella Laurent, she was nothing like the typical women who tried to catch his eye at social galas and charity events. Isabella was the niece of William Gardner, a close friend to the Blackwood family. She was modest yet elegant, with a quiet poise that struck Richard during their first meeting. At a small dinner party in the Gardner estate, she wore a pastel blue gown that highlighted her delicate features. Her dark hair was pinned back in a simple chignon, and her laughter was light, like the sound of distant chimes. It was said that the moment Richard saw her smile, something in him softened, if only for a fleeting second. That night, Isabella and Richard sat next to each other, discussing literature over a 3-course meal. She recounted her love for classic novels by the fireplace, and he spoke of his ambitions for his newly inherited empire. It was one of those rare moments when Richard's armor slipped, revealing glimpses of the man he had once been: compassionate, spirited, and yearning for genuine connection. Months passed quickly in a whirl of discreet dates and candle-lit dinners. Their relationship developed with surprising speed. Friends remarked how Isabella seemed to bring out a gentler side of Richard. Even Dr. Andrew Montague noticed a change in the man. Richard had started dropping by the hospital with donations and would sometimes inquire after the children's welfare more earnestly. But no romance exists in a vacuum, and neither did theirs. Rumors spread that Richard's fortune had begun experiencing hidden troubles. The real estate arm of his conglomerate faced a legal challenge from environmental activists. Certain business associates whispered that Richard had grown more controlling and paranoid behind the scenes. He insisted on reading all the financial reports himself, scrutinizing every line as if waiting for a betrayal. Still, Isabella stood by him, unwavering. In private, she would assure him that no matter what happened, she had faith in his capacity to triumph over his struggles. She believed in the fundamental goodness that she saw within him, even when he doubted himself. Perhaps that unwavering belief in the face of turmoil was what led her to marry him after just a year of courtship. Their wedding was a lavish affair, a regal ceremony at the Blackwood Manor's private chapel, followed by a reception in the garden. White orchids, Isabella's favorite flowers, cascaded down marble pillars, and the estate glowed under thousands of fairy lights. For a time, it was bliss. They traveled to Europe for their honeymoon, visiting cathedrals and art galleries. Isabella kept a small leather-bound journal in which she jotted down tiny details of their journey, how the moon lit the Seine on their midnight stroll in Paris, how Richard had smiled at a group of local children performing by the Piazza San Marco in Venice. In those early days, happiness was real, tangible, but shadows often lurk in the corners of even the brightest rooms. Returning to Blackwood Manor, they found that Isabella's health began to falter. It started with simple fatigue. She would tire halfway up the grand staircase. Then migraines tormented her at night. She'd wake up trembling from feverish dreams. As her condition worsened, the doctors were baffled. Test after test came back inconclusive. Dr. Andrew Montague, now a trusted friend, recommended specialists across the country. But nobody could pinpoint the exact nature of her ailment. Richard, initially alarmed, poured money into researching the best medical solutions. He brought in private caregivers. He personally escorted her to the top neurological and immunological experts. At night, he sat by her bedside, reminding her of the stories they shared on their honeymoon. Yet as the weeks turned to months, and months slid inexorably into a year, his patience began to wear thin. Stress from his faltering businesses piled on, and mounting debts from the expansions he had pursued weighed heavily on his shoulders. He grew irritable and remote. Perhaps the shifting economy bore down on him, or perhaps it was the heartbreak of watching Isabella suffer without any clear diagnosis. One moment, he would hold her hand tenderly, promising to stand by her. The next, he'd snap at her for the smallest things, an innocuous question, a worried glance. The staff at Blackwood Manor could see the tension building like dark clouds on a horizon. None of them could have predicted just how bad it would get, nor how much Isabella would endure in silence before everything came crashing down. For the first 6 months following Isabella's deterioration, Richard clung to the hope that her condition would improve. He hired private nurses around the clock, including Caroline Peterson, whose name was well regarded among the wealthy families along the East Coast for her compassionate bedside manner. Caroline was gentle and efficient, ensuring Isabella received her medications on time and her vital signs were monitored meticulously. Through night shifts and early mornings, Caroline maintained a calm, reassuring presence that gave Isabella a semblance of normalcy. But as the seasons changed outside the estate's sprawling gardens, summer flowers giving way to autumn leaves, Richard's behavior took on a sharper edge. He would question Caroline's methods, accusing her of inefficiency if Isabella so much as coughed unexpectedly. He demanded that every test result be delivered to him immediately, not trusting the medical team to interpret anything correctly. Anxiety and anger seemed to fuel him, and in turn, Richard took on more of the caretaker role himself, almost obsessively. One early evening, Dr. Andrew Montague arrived at Blackwood Manor to review Isabella's newest test results. In the past, Richard would greet the doctor in the foyer or invite him into the study for a glass of brandy. This time, Andrew found himself waiting in the parlour for nearly half an hour, listening to muffled arguments from behind a closed door. When Richard finally emerged, his face was flushed, and he spoke in clipped, cold tones. "Dr. Montague," he said, barely looking at him, "Caroline has the file for you. Make sure everything's in order." Andrew tried to inquire about the argument he had overheard, but Richard brushed it off, claiming it was a personal matter. Concern flickered across the doctor's face. He was worried not only about Isabella's failing health, but also about Richard's mental state. After all, Andrew had known him for a decade. He had seen the transformations in the man's demeanor. Once upstairs, Andrew examined Isabella. Her condition had worsened from the last time. Her skin was pallid, dark circles etched under her eyes. She winced whenever he touched her wrists to check her pulse. Caroline informed him that Isabella had new symptoms, occasional memory lapses, moments of disorientation that left her frightened. Each time, Richard's frustration seemed to grow. Isabella tried to smile. "I'm all right, really." "It's just a bad day," she whispered weakly, forcing warmth into her eyes. Andrew could see the sorrow behind them. He recommended a new MRI scan to check for any neurological abnormalities missed by previous tests. Isabella nodded, her voice trembled when she thanked him for his concern. That night, a storm raged outside. Thunderclaps shook the windows, and lightning forked across the sky. In their bedroom, Isabella lay trembling under the covers. Her sickness made her vulnerable to the sudden noise. Unable to sleep, she silently watched Richard, who paced the floor in agitation. "We'll get the results back in 2 days," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We have to figure this out, or we'll go broke with these endless tests." Though his tone was harsh, Isabella recognized a kernel of real terror in his words, fear of losing her, losing control, and losing the fortune he had worked so hard to expand. She reached out a trembling hand to him, wanting to offer comfort, but he flinched away, heading to the window to watch the rain. As the storm pressed on through the night, a different kind of tempest brewed inside Richard's mind. His business empire was buckling under intense pressure, with shareholders demanding reassurances and debts piling up. Meanwhile, every new doctor's visit for Isabella siphoned more money from his estate. He convinced himself that if he just pushed hard enough for answers, for treatments, some solution would appear. But the more he fought, the more powerless he felt. Powerlessness was an emotion Richard Blackwood had never been equipped to handle. Instead, he lashed out. He demanded that Isabella try new experimental drugs or insisted she undergo additional invasive procedures. He wanted progress, visible proof that the woman he loved would not slip away. When each measure failed to yield immediate improvement, he accused her of not trying hard enough or of exaggerating her pain. He clung to the idea that Isabella's symptoms were somehow within her control, a perspective that slowly veered into cruelty. Caroline Peterson, the private nurse, was the first to confront him. She approached him one late afternoon in the Manor's grand library, where he was reviewing stock market reports. Timidly, she expressed concern that Isabella needed more emotional support, not just medical tests. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice hesitant, "your wife is frightened. She's in pain. These new rounds of tests are very stressful. Could we slow down, for her sake, until we see some results?" His reaction was immediate fury. Slamming his tablet on the mahogany desk, he spat, "You dare question my judgment? Her condition gets worse by the day, and you want me to sit idly by? Who's paying your salary, Miss Peterson?" Caroline froze. "Of course, sir. I'm not questioning your intentions. I only enough," he snapped, forcing her to retreat, tears threatening in her eyes. "Do your job, or I'll find someone else who can." From that day forward, Caroline found herself treading carefully around him, speaking only in hushed tones when necessary, fearful of stoking his temper. She reported everything to Dr. Montague, who became increasingly alarmed at the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor, so he arranged to visit again, unannounced. Yet each time Andrew tried to talk sense into Richard, it was like speaking to a man drowning in darkness. Richard refused to concede any point, convinced he alone could save his wife by sheer force of will. In the months that followed, the estate's staff noticed changes in Isabella. She began to lose not just her physical strength, but also her once bright spirit. She seldom left her room, scarcely ate a full meal, and flinched whenever Richard entered the room. Late at night, if one passed her bedroom door, they might hear soft crying. And if they listened more closely, they might catch fragments of Richard's angry rants, accusations that Isabella was a burden, that she was draining him financially, emotionally, and socially. None of them knew how far Richard would go or how deeply Isabella's sorrow would carve out her heart in the coming days. They only sensed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Inside the centuries-old walls of Blackwood Manor, corridors seemed to stretch into darkness. The tapestry-lined hallways bore silent witness to the tension rising between husband and wife. Richard's footsteps echoed day and night, his mood shifting erratically. Sometimes he would spend hours by Isabella's side, fussing over her blankets, rereading test results, or demanding the nurses keep a closer eye on her. Other times he would vanish into his private study, locking the door behind him to brood over financial ledgers. Isabella, frail and burdened by illness, found solace in only two things. The first was her journal, a tiny leather-bound notebook where she penned her innermost thoughts, prayers and fears. The second was the old greenhouse attached to the manor, an abandoned relic of a time when Richard's grandmother cultivated rare orchids. Isabella often asked Caroline or another nurse to escort her there when she could muster the strength, to sit among the neglected plants and just breathe. One morning, as a thin winter sun struggled through the frosted glass of the greenhouse, Isabella's trembling hand clutched her journal. Caroline, discreetly watering a few surviving succulents, noticed how tears slipped down Isabella's cheeks. She approached carefully. "Madam, are you all right? Can I get you anything?" Isabella shook her head, her eyes vacant. "I'm just thinking about what I can't say aloud." "It helps to write." Caroline hesitated, torn between professional boundaries and genuine concern. Finally, she said, "If you ever need to confide in someone, I'm here to listen." Isabella managed a wan smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Unbeknownst to either of them, Richard stood just beyond a row of potted ferns, quietly observing, his eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring. He had become strangely paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that Isabella was hiding secrets from him, secrets about her health, or maybe about her intentions. He reasoned that her family might encourage her to sue him for negligence, or that she planned to leave him. The constant swirl of anxieties in his mind made him see conspiracies in every shadow. He stepped forward, startling them both. "Isabella," he said, voice low, "you're out of bed." She looked up, startled. "I needed some fresh air. Caroline was kind enough to bring me here." Richard surveyed the scene, looking at the journal clasped in her hands. "What are you writing, my dear?" Her grip on the notebook tightened. "Just personal thoughts. Nothing to worry about." Caroline intervened. "Mr. Blackwood, the greenhouse environment seems to help Miss S. Blackwood relax." She seemed better today. His gaze flicked to Caroline, cold and piercing. "Go inside," he ordered. "I wish to speak to my wife alone." Caroline's eyes darted to Isabella, concerned, but she had no choice but to leave. A heavy silence settled over the greenhouse. Richard stepped closer, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding ominously final. "You know you can talk to me," he began, his tone deceptively gentle. "I've done everything for you, haven't I?" Isabella's eyes welled with tears. She wanted to believe in that gentle note in his voice, that the man she had once fallen in love with was still there. But the memory of his angry outbursts and the sting of his accusations remained fresh. "I do talk to you, Richard," she replied softly, "but sometimes I need to sort out my thoughts first." He slowly extended his hand, palm up. "Let me see what you wrote." Her heart pounded. Inside those pages were confessions of her isolation, her anguish at his cruelty, and her longing for the kindness he once showed. She feared what might happen if he read them. Gathering her courage, she shook her head. "These are my private reflections, Richard." His face hardened, an edge of hostility flaring. "Private? In my house? I pay for everything here, including your medical bills. Do you think you can hide something from me?" Pain lanced through Isabella's chest. She hugged the journal to her chest. "Richard, please, He grabbed her wrist, not forcefully enough to injure, but with a firm, threatening grip. "You're trembling. Are you cold or afraid of me?" She didn't answer. Tears spilled down her cheeks. After a tense moment, he let go of her, turning sharply away. "Go back to bed," he ordered. "The greenhouse is no place for you in your condition." With that, he stomped off, leaving her feeling small and wretched, tears silently marking her sorrow. That night, Isabella tried to talk to him. She wanted to remind him of their love, their promises. She recalled that day at the Gardner estate when they first met. She remembered the joy in his eyes, the day they waltzed in their private suite after their wedding. But every time she tried to bring it up, his phone rang or he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, consumed by business calls. A new rumor had surfaced that Richard's pharmaceutical wing was under federal investigation for malpractices regarding a newly developed cancer drug. The same drug that was, ironically, recommended for Isabella's experimental treatment. He was furious, raving about possible conspiracies. He snapped at her if she mentioned anything about the investigation, telling her it was none of her concern. In the eyes of Blackwood Manor staff, her well-being became overshadowed by his searing obsession with saving his empire. Weeks trickled by, each day longer than the last. Isabella's condition showed no signs of improvement. She lost weight, her cheeks sunk, and she often lay in bed, too exhausted to even read. Richard, frustrated, sought out second and third opinions, demanding immediate solutions. Doctors, intimidated by his status and short temper, did their best but had no conclusive answers. One cold January evening, a harrowing incident changed the atmosphere entirely. Isabella woke, gasping for air, her face pale and her breath ragged. A panicked Caroline rushed to administer oxygen. "Doctor!" Montague arrived within the hour, and for a horrifying moment, they feared Isabella might not make it through the night. After stabilizing her, Montague confronted Richard in the hallway. "You're pushing her too hard," the doctor accused. "These new procedures, the stress, it's too much for her. She needs stability, not more chaos." Richard's eyes blazed. "Chaos is what's going on in my business. I won't sit here and watch her die while you do nothing. If you can't help her, I'll find someone else who will." Montague swallowed his frustration. "This is beyond any single doctor's capability. We need thorough evaluations. We need to give her peace and time to rest." "You're suffocating her with demands," Richard sneered. "Don't tell me how to take care of my wife." That night, in a fit of paranoid rage, Richard searched Isabella's bedroom while she slept, rummaging through drawers, opening cabinets. He found her journal tucked under her pillow, but he only thumbed through the first page before his conscience, or whatever remained of it, stopped him. He realized that if he read further, he might see himself in a monstrous light, and deep down, perhaps a part of him feared that truth. He placed the journal back exactly where he found it, returning to his own room with fists clenched. Sleep eluded him as guilt and anger warred in his mind. Outside, the old oak trees rattled in the winter wind, their branches scraping against the estate walls like ghostly fingers, as though the house itself was warning him of what was to come. Tension in Blackwood Manor reached a breaking point as February's chill set in. Instead of seeking solace in each other, Richard and Isabella existed like strangers. They inhabited the same house, but their conversations were painfully brief, mostly about her treatments or about finances. The gap that once might have been bridged by love was now widened by fear, suspicion, and unresolved pain. Desperate for relief, Isabella requested to see an old friend, Mary Thompson, a woman she had known since childhood. Mary was a gentle soul who traveled extensively as a missionary nurse in Southeast Asia. Upon hearing Isabella's plea, Mary immediately arrived, her concern palpable. She was shocked by Isabella's frail appearance, and the anxiety etched into her face. They met in Isabella's bedroom, a place that should have been a tranquil sanctuary, but instead felt oppressive, with the heavy curtains drawn and the constant hum of medical equipment. Mary embraced her, tears shining in her eyes. "Oh, Isabella, I wish I had come sooner," she whispered. Isabella clung to her. He's different, Mary," she said, voice cracking. "I don't know if it's my illness or something else, but it feels like he's slipping away from me." Mary listened, heartbroken by her friend's plight. Over the following days, she tried to speak with Richard, attempting to remind him of the joys and wonders of the early days of his marriage. But he was guarded, polite, but distant. Whenever Mary tried to approach the subject of his apparent hostility, he changed topics abruptly or claimed pressing business matters. Then, one afternoon, Mary discovered something peculiar while talking to Caroline in the Manor's kitchen. There was a large volume of prescription drugs delivered each week, far more than what Isabella's doctors had officially authorized. When Mary pressed Caroline on this, the nurse explained that Richard insisted on keeping a stocked supply of various experimental medications. He believed in proactive treatment, or so he claimed, but Caroline found the quantity alarming. Worse, Mary noticed that some of the drugs stored in the locked cupboard near Isabella's room had never been used before, and no doctor was prescribing them. It was as if Richard was hoarding medication in the desperate hope of stumbling upon a cure. Or perhaps, she thought grimly, there was another reason entirely. One evening, Mary took a walk down the dim corridor leading to Richard's study. She found the door slightly ajar, and inside, Richard was on the phone, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. She caught snippets of the conversation, talk of funds being depleted, covering up allegations, and keeping her condition confidential. Mary's stomach churned as she pieced together the implications. It sounded like Richard was juggling not just his wife's illness, but also a scandal that could ruin him. Was he seeing Isabella more as a liability than a beloved partner? As Mary prepared to leave the manor that night, she paused at Isabella's door. She heard whimpering inside. Carefully, she stepped in and found Isabella curled on the bed, her journal clutched to her chest. Tear tracks glistened on her cheeks. "Bella?" Mary whispered, using Isabella's nickname from their youth. "I've written down everything," Isabella murmured, her voice hollow. "I wrote about his anger, the money trouble, and how I feel trapped. I'm afraid he's going to hate me more if he sees this, but I also feel like I need it, so that I remember who I am." Mary's heart broke. "You won't be trapped forever," she consoled. "I promise. We'll figure something out. Is there anywhere else you can go? Another family member?" Isabella shook her head. "No, I can't leave. I can't. My body is too weak. And a part of me still hopes that the man I love is still in there." Mary stayed the night, sleeping on a chaise beside Isabella's bed. She held her friend's hand as the hours ticked by in oppressive silence. In the middle of the night, Isabella jerked awake from a nightmare, her hair drenched in sweat. She gasped, shaking. "He was screaming at me," she sobbed, "telling me I was worthless." Mary wrapped her arms around her until she calmed. When morning came, Mary was resolved to approach Richard directly. She found him in the dining hall reading the newspapers. "Good morning," she said, mustering courage. He glanced up, eyes cold. "Mary, leaving today?" She inhaled. "I want to talk to you about Isabella." Richard folded the newspaper, setting it aside. "I'm listening." "She's afraid of you," Mary began, cutting straight to the point. "Something is deeply wrong here, Richard. I don't know if it's your financial troubles or stress over her condition, but you're hurting her more than helping." His jaw tightened. "I suggest you mind your own business. Isabella is my wife. I'm doing my best. Your best is terrifying her." Mary couldn't contain the tremor in her voice. "She's ill, Richard, and she needs compassion, not threats and constant pressure. If you truly love her, you'll step back, His fist slammed down on the table, rattling the china. "You have no idea what I'm going through. The expansions, the lawsuits, the hospital bills. She doesn't deserve half the sacrifices I've made for her. She sits there complaining while I bleed my finances dry to find a cure for something no doctor can identify. Mary felt a surge of protectiveness. That's her life, Richard, not some commodity you can buy and fix. She's suffering. He stood abruptly, pointing to the door. Get out. Now, you're trespassing on my patience. She met his gaze, refusing to cower. You will regret this, she said softly. If anything happens to her, anything, you will regret it 1,000 times. With that, she left, her heart pounding and tears threatening to fall. She felt helpless, uncertain how to protect Isabella if she refused to leave. All Mary could do was pray that the gentle woman she loved like a sister would not be consumed by Richard's growing darkness. In the ensuing weeks, Isabella's health spiraled downward at an alarming rate. Once or twice she tried to confide in Richard about her nightmares and creeping despair. Every time, he brushed her off, claiming that her negativity was fueling her illness. Worse, he began isolating her from outside contact. Calls from Mary and Dr. Montague were monitored, and staff were forbidden from discussing Isabella's condition with anyone outside the manor. Even Caroline Peterson found her movements restricted. She could only tend to Isabella under Richard's watchful eye. At night, she'd retreat to the small room allocated to her in the servants' wing, uneasy about what she witnessed. Sometimes distant cries and muffled arguments drifted through the hallways, always followed by a tense, suffocating stillness. One particular evening, Caroline found Isabella sobbing quietly in her bed after dinner. The tray of food lay untouched. Her eyes were swollen from tears, and bruises lined her wrists. Bruises she tried to hide under the covers. Fearing the worst, Caroline gently asked, "Did Richard do this to you, ma'am?" Isabella didn't answer right away. Her lip trembled and fresh tears spilled. Finally she choked out, "It was an accident." He was angry about some business deal that fell through. I tried to calm him, but he grabbed me by the arm. He didn't mean to. Caroline's throat tightened. "Isabella, this is not all right. You don't deserve this. What can I do? I can call Mary or Doctor." "Montague, no, please," Isabella pleaded, her voice trembling. "Richard forbade any outside help. If he finds out, it will only make things worse." Caroline struggled with her ethical duty. Her instincts screamed that this was domestic abuse, that she should call authorities or get someone else involved. But she also feared for Isabella's safety if she defied Richard. She resolved to find a moment to call Dr. Montague in secret. That night, Richard stormed into Isabella's bedroom, pacing around like a caged animal. "Did you take your medication?" he demanded, his tone clipped. Isabella nodded weakly. He eyed her suspiciously. "All of it?" "Yes," she whispered, terrified by his abruptness. He sat down beside her, an odd mix of rage and desperation in his eyes. "I can't lose you," he said, voice tight. "Do you understand? I've poured everything into finding a cure, my resources, my energy. If you don't survive." He trailed off, a haunted look passing over his features. She stared at him, wanting to reach out, to remind him of the vows they had taken. But there was a distance between them now that felt insurmountable. She realized with painful clarity that she no longer recognized the man before her. "Richard," she began softly, "I don't need expensive treatments or the best doctors in the world. I just need you to be there for me. I need your kindness, your love." He scoffed, rising to his feet. "I'm doing what I must. Love? Love won't pay for the hospital bills when you go back for another experimental therapy. Love won't keep my shareholders at bay. If I fail, it's the end of everything our family built." Her gaze dropped to her hands. "Sometimes it's not about building more, but preserving what truly matters." Angered by her words, he kicked the nightstand, nearly toppling a vase. Isabella jumped, startled by his violence. Richard left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him. Days later, Dr. Montague tried to visit unannounced. Richard refused him entry, threatening legal action if the doctor didn't leave. Stunned and worried, Montague managed to slip Caroline his phone number, urging her to call whenever she could. As winter melted into the early hints of spring, Isabella's condition grew dire. She experienced frequent fainting spells and had difficulty breathing. One night, after collapsing in the hallway, she lay unconscious for almost 3 minutes before Caroline could revive her. Richard, unhinged by fear, began blaming her for refusing to fight. "She's given up," he ranted to Caroline in the library. "She's not even trying anymore. All she does is complain and mope around. I won't tolerate it." Caroline was aghast. "Sir, she's dying. She's not choosing this. It's—" "Shut up," he roared, slamming a book onto the table. "Do not speak to me about choice. I've sacrificed enough. If she won't fight, I'll make her fight. If the only way to get her back is to force her, I will." In that moment, Caroline felt truly frightened for Isabella. She locked herself in her quarters, managing to send a brief message to Dr. Montague. "She's in danger. He's losing control. Please help." She waited for a reply, uncertain if it would come in time. The next day proved tragic. Isabella grew delirious with fever. She wandered the halls, calling out incoherently for Mary, for her late parents, for Richard, sometimes mistaking staff for her mother. When Richard found her in this delirious state, he snapped. He dragged her by the arm to her bedroom, insisting she take another dose of medication that hadn't even been prescribed by her primary doctor. Isabella resisted, half screaming, half pleading for him to stop. Their argument escalated in the worst way. In the heat of his rage, he shoved her onto the bed. Her head struck the headboard, and she crumpled, eyes rolling back. For an agonizing moment, Richard froze in horror at what he'd done. Caroline rushed in, blood draining from her face as she called for an ambulance. Isabella was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctor Montague met them there, his expression grim as paramedics wheeled her into the emergency ward. Richard paced the waiting area, shock etched into his features. Hours later, the doctors emerged, telling him that Isabella was in a coma. Her weakened body had finally given out, and there was significant swelling in her brain. Richard felt something shatter inside him as he sank into a chair. He was left with one haunting thought: this can't be happening. But deep down, he knew he had crossed a line that day, perhaps one that could never be uncrossed. Isabella lingered in the coma for 2 agonizing weeks. Each day, the doctors updated Richard with the same bleak news. Her vitals were unstable, her brain activity minimal, and her prognosis uncertain. Guilt gnawed at him, steadily eroding the armor of denial he had built around himself. He practically lived in the hospital, pacing the corridors, ignoring the stares of nurses who had heard rumors of what happened. He spent nights slumped in a chair beside Isabella's bed, resting his head on the sterile sheets. Sometimes, in a moment of restless half-sleep, he would dream of their honeymoon in Paris, of Isabella's laughter echoing under the glittering Eiffel Tower. Then he would wake to the beep of life support machines and the haunting sight of his wife, frail and unmoving. Dr. Montague was equally exhausted, though in a different way. Having fought for Isabella's well-being for months, he was now bearing witness to her final, precarious state. He confronted Richard whenever he could, but the millionaire often brushed him aside, lost in self-recrimination. "You should have listened to us," Andrew finally said one morning, cornering Richard in the hallway. "She needed care, not constant stress. She needed you to be a husband, not a warden." Richard clenched his jaw, staring at the floor. "I know. I can't undo what's been done." During Isabella's second week in the coma, something unexpected happened. A nurse, while changing the linens in her hospital room, discovered Isabella's small, leather-bound journal hidden in the folds of her blanket. She handed it to Dr. Montague. He recognized it immediately from Isabella's old habit of journaling. Unsure what to do, he decided to read it, hoping it might offer clues about her condition, or perhaps a final testament of her wishes. Montague carefully flipped through the pages. His eyes flicked over Isabella's neat, looping script. She wrote about her pain, her loneliness, her confusion over Richard's behavior, and her desperate hope that he would return to her as the loving man she married. She described the times he lost his temper, how frightened she felt, how she rationalized his bursts of anger as the product of stress. But each page became more heartbreaking than the last. Deeper in the journal, there was a startling passage. It revealed that Isabella had been secretly meeting with a personal attorney, Marcus Bellows, to draw up a philanthropic trust. The trust's purpose? To channel a portion of her inheritance, which she had received from her late aunt, into medical research for rare diseases. She wrote that she never told Richard about the trust, fearing that his deteriorating empathy and obsession with financial control would lead him to shut it down. She wanted to make a difference, to give purpose to her suffering by helping others. She also mentioned she suspected her own illness might be among those rare diseases that the research could someday address. The shock that truly rattled Dr. Montague was her repeated worry that Richard would misunderstand her secret philanthropy as a betrayal. She noted that she wanted to reveal it to him once her trust was legally secure, hoping it might rekindle his belief in helping others rather than succumbing to greed. Toward the end, she wrote in shaky handwriting, "If I die before I can tell him the truth, I pray he finds forgiveness and learns that love cannot be bought or forced, it can only be given, freely and wholeheartedly." With shaking hands, Dr. Montague shared the journal entries with Mary Thompson, who had rushed back to town when she heard about Isabella's coma. Together, they debated whether Richard should see it. Mary argued that he needed to know the truth, even if it tore him apart. Dr. Montague agreed. Later that day, they found Richard in the hospital cafeteria, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles. Dr. Montague slid the journal across the table. "Read it," Mary said, her voice tight with emotion. Richard looked confused, picking up the worn notebook. As he read Isabella's words, page by page, tears formed in his eyes, his face twisted with anguish. He saw how she had never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping for him. She had hidden her philanthropic efforts, not out of deceit, but out of a deep fear that his controlling nature would sabotage her dream. She had, in essence, tried to protect him from himself, hoping one day he'd see the light in her act of generosity. When he finished reading, Richard's eyes brimmed with tears that finally spilled onto the pages. He clutched the journal to his chest, gasping for breath as though he'd been punched in the gut. All his anger, paranoia, and cruelty, the reckless drive that led him to harm the one person he claimed to love, came crashing down in that single moment of realization. Mary's voice cut through the silence. "She was trying to help you, Richard. She believed in you, even when you gave her every reason not to." His voice cracked. I never knew. I thought she was plotting against me, draining my finances. But she wanted to help people. And he couldn't finish his sentence. Sobs choking him. For Mary, it was painfully bittersweet to see him finally stripped of his anger, replaced now with regret that would likely haunt him forever. Wordlessly, Dr. Montague laid a hand on Richard's shoulder. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, letting him cry into the open pages of Isabella's greatest secret. Neither Mary nor Montague could bring themselves to hate him entirely, even after everything. They saw a broken man, cracked open by the truth of the damage he had done. Now, The question lingered in the stale hospital air. Would this revelation come in time for Richard to make amends to the woman lying comatose, her fate uncertain? On the 15th day of Isabella's coma, her doctors delivered a grim bulletin. Her brain function had deteriorated. If she ever woke, she would likely be severely disabled. The news shattered Richard all over again. Each day since reading her journal, he had sat at her bedside, tearfully apologizing, replaying their memories in his mind. He had the journal with him constantly, rereading her words, her hopes, her trust in his better nature. Every line felt like a knife, twisting in his chest. Mary and Dr. Montague visited often, offering emotional support. Still, no one could truly soothe the regret that consumed him. He was forced to confront the monstrous side of himself that had pushed Isabella to such despair. The staff at the hospital treated him with a mixture of pity and quiet disdain, but Richard scarcely noticed. His entire world had narrowed down to Isabella's hospital room and the fragile thread of life that bound her to this world. One drab afternoon, while a light rain pattered against the hospital windows, Richard found Isabella's hand stirring faintly. He jumped from his chair, heart pounding, her eyelids fluttered. "Isabella?" He breathed, pressing his lips to her knuckles. She opened her eyes, though they remained cloudy and distant. Her chest rose in shallow breaths, and her gaze flicked around the room, uncertain. She looked at Richard with a flicker of recognition, then a tear slid down her cheek. Richard pressed the call button, frantic, summoning nurses. Dr. Montague arrived swiftly. With gentle instructions, he tested her reflexes and tried to gauge her awareness. Isabella could barely speak, a rasp escaping her throat. They managed to understand a few words, Richard. The first, "Sorry." Her apology broke him. "No," he choked out, tears streaming. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I'm the one." His voice trembled, and he gripped her hand, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. Over the next 2 days, Isabella drifted between fleeting moments of partial consciousness and deep confusion. Sometimes she'd call out for her mother or Mary, not remembering where she was. Other times she seemed to lock her gaze on Richard, as if trying to convey 1,000 unspoken words in her frail state. On the 3rd day after she regained partial consciousness, Mary was by her side, reciting prayers softly. Dr. Montague stood near the window, scanning her most recent vitals. Richard sat close to the bed, gently stroking Isabella's hair. She blinked slowly, her face pale as porcelain. In a trembling whisper, she called out for Richard. He leaned in. "Yes, my love, I'm here." "Home," she murmured. "Can we go home?" Richard's heart twisted. "If the doctors say it's safe, yes. I'll take you anywhere you want." Her lips twitched into what could have been a faint smile. "The greenhouse. Want to see. The flowers." Again, tears slipped down his cheeks as he nodded. "We will, I promise. I'll have it restored. The greenhouse will be filled with new blooms for you." He tried to keep his voice steady, fighting the fear that she might never actually make it out of the hospital. That night, Isabella's condition took a sharp turn. Her organs began to fail from the stress her body endured. Alarms beeped, nurses and doctors rushed in. Richard was ushered out, helplessly watching through the glass panel as they attempted to stabilize her. Mary clung to him, tears streaming down both their faces. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Montague emerged, exhausted. She's not responding to treatment. There's nothing else we can do." His voice wavered, the weight of the words nearly too much to bear. Richard swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "I want to be with her," he whispered. They led him into the room. Isabella lay motionless, a shell of the vibrant woman he once knew. He sat down beside her, taking her hand in both of his. Guilt and sorrow pressed on his chest like a suffocating vice. He pressed his forehead to hers, remembering the early days of their courtship, the stolen kisses, the laughter, her boundless compassion. "I'm so sorry," he breathed. "For everything. If I could trade places with you, I would." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, clouded with pain, but she seemed to recognize him. Her lips parted in a weak attempt to speak. Richard leaned closer. She managed one final shallow breath, and then her eyes closed, her entire body going limp. A hush fell over the room as the monitors emitted a continuous, piercing tone. Her heart had stopped. Nurses hurried in, starting CPR, but within minutes they ceased their efforts at Dr. Montague's signal. She was gone. Richard wept into Isabella's hair, cradling her lifeless body. Mary turned away, tears streaming, while Dr. Montague bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. In that moment, Richard realized the full magnitude of his loss. He had driven away the only person who loved him unconditionally, and no wealth or power in the world could bring her back. The funeral took place a week later, a subdued ceremony in the private chapel of Blackwood Manor. A few close acquaintances and family friends attended, though many had distanced themselves in the aftermath of rumors about Richard's abusive behavior. The staff hovered discreetly in the background, some of them in tears. They had seen Isabella's kindness firsthand. Richard stood near the closed coffin, black suit immaculately pressed, but his face drawn and hollow. He had aged 10 years in those final weeks. When the officiant asked if anyone wished to share memories of Isabella, Mary Thompson stepped forward. She spoke of Isabella's gentle spirit, her unwavering faith, and her quiet acts of generosity. Each word felt like a blow to Richard's guilt-ridden mind. After the service, people filed out into the courtyard. Mary approached Richard. In her hands was the leather-bound journal. She extended it to him. "She would want you to keep it," Mary said softly. Richard's lip quivered. He accepted the journal, cradling it like a precious relic. "Thank you," was all he could manage. In the days that followed, a deep silence settled over Blackwood Manor. Most of the staff were given extended leave, and Caroline Peterson found employment elsewhere. She felt unable to stay in the house, haunted by Isabella's final suffering. Dr. Montague likewise distanced himself, though he remained in occasional contact via phone calls, urging Richard to seek therapy. Alone in his study, Richard pored over his finances. The estate teetered on the brink of ruin. Lawsuits and investigations had escalated, his name tarnished by the press speculating on domestic abuse. Shareholders demanded a leadership change in his conglomerate. Strangely, he felt none of his old drive to salvage his empire. Without Isabella, the money seemed meaningless. Late one night, while rummaging through the documents in a desk drawer, he stumbled upon a sealed envelope addressed to him in Isabella's handwriting. His heart pounded as he carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, dated just a month before her coma. "Dearest Richard, I know we've been struggling, and I see the weight you carry. Despite the pain, I still believe in the man I love. The one who'd walk through fire for me if he could. I know you've lost faith in yourself, but I haven't. I'm writing to you because there's a trust I've set up for rare disease research. It's my way of making sense of my illness, to ensure no one else suffers without answers. I feared telling you, worried you'd be angry, but I hope you can find it in your heart to support this mission, even if it seems foolish to you right now. One day, this research might save someone else, maybe even me, if it happens in time. If you're reading this, I suppose my fears were valid, and circumstances have turned dark. But remember, Richard, that love is not about ownership or control. It's about giving without demands, trusting without fear. If you can learn this lesson, our hardships won't have been in vain. I love you, and always will. Your Isabella tears blurred his vision. She had known he might become enraged, yet she still wrote this letter in hope. A new wave of regret and longing crashed over him. He realized that the only way he might ever find a sliver of peace was to fulfill her final wish. And so Richard Blackwood did the one thing that might redeem his tortured conscience. he called Marcus Bellows, Isabella's attorney. He pledged his cooperation in fully funding the philanthropic trust. Despite the precarious state of his finances, he sold his shares in multiple ventures, liquidated assets, anything to ensure that Isabella's trust would be established exactly as she intended. Word spread quietly of Richard's transformation. Some called it a cynical ploy to rebuild his public image. But those who knew him closely, like Dr. Montague, recognized genuine remorse. Richard also sought therapy, confronting his guilt, his anger, and the toxic ambition that drove him to madness. Therapy was not a quick fix, nor did it erase what he had done, but it began a process of self-reflection and accountability. Months later, the trust launched officially under Isabella's name, the Isabella Blackwood Foundation for Rare Disease Research. A modest ceremony took place in the greenhouse at Blackwood Manor, now fully restored and bursting with exotic flowers. Mary was invited and accepted. Dr. Montague was there too, as well as a handful of scientists and physicians dedicated to the foundation's cause. Richard stood at the podium, addressing the small group. His voice trembled. "This greenhouse was Isabella's refuge," he said. "She always found hope in growth, in nature's resilience. I destroyed much of that hope in her, and for that I will always be sorry. But in her name, I want to nurture new life for others who suffer as she did." It was a sobering speech, devoid of the arrogance that once defined him. When he finished, there was a brief applause. Tears glistened in Mary's eyes. Dr. Montague inclined his head in quiet approval. That evening, after everyone left, Richard lingered in the greenhouse. He placed a single white orchid, Isabella's favorite, in a pot near the walkway. The overhead lights bathed the blooms in a gentle glow, reflecting off the glass walls. He stood there in silent reflection, the journal tucked under his arm, letting the night air fill his lungs. Finally, he spoke to the empty space, his voice hushed but determined. "I can't change the past," he said, tears forming. "But I promise you, Isabella, I'll do better. I'm sorry it took losing you to see the truth." He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of orchids, hoping that somewhere, in some intangible realm, she might hear him. In that quiet sanctuary of living blossoms, Richard Blackwood vowed to live out the rest of his days, honoring the woman he had loved too late and lost forever. Richard Blackwood's tragic journey reminds us all that love can be a fragile, precious thing nurtured by care, yet destroyed by neglect and cruelty. In the end, no amount of wealth or power could undo the wrongs he inflicted upon Isabella. But with Isabella's guiding spirit, he found a glimmer of redemption by dedicating his resources to helping others in her memory. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with friends and family. Let the tale of Richard and Isabella's heartbreak serve as a reminder that love demands compassion and honesty, not control. Like this video if you believe in second chances, share it to spread the cautionary wisdom of their story, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, thought-provoking tales. By engaging with this story, we keep Isabella's legacy of hope alive and remind ourselves to cherish the love we have before it's too late.